Welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 25 of The Kill File. I am so glad that you guys are here. I wanted to give a quick shout out to those of you who are telling your friends or family about The Kill File and spreading the word of our podcast. You have no idea what it means to me, and I hope that you will continue to get the word out there. I know for myself, when I discovered podcasts, it's been life-changing for me, listening to cases while I complete daily stuff like cleaning or whatever at home. I hope that we can get more and more people to join us for our weekly cases. Don't forget, sometime soon, I will be opening some sort of monthly subscription service for even more content for you guys. Reach out to me. Let me know what you guys would want out of bonus content. Would you simply want another case every week? Would you want a few shorter cases, like each month? Do you want me to cover the bigger ones and make them in several parts, like a deep dive? Let me know via social media or by email, thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com. Okay, that's it for business today. Let's get to the case. So today's case, fair warning, is going to be a gnarly one. And what I mean by gnarly is just gory and horrifying and honestly terrifying when you find out what happened and the outcome. Today we are going to cover the Greyhound Bus Murder. It's also known as the brutal murder of Tim McLean. Today's trigger warnings are going to be murder, body mutilation, cannibalism, and just all-around gruesomeness. Let's get to it. This case takes place in July of 2008 on a Greyhound bus in Canada. The first person that we are going to talk about is Tim McLean, a 22-year-old young man who boarded bus 1170 in Edmonton. Tim was headed back to his hometown, which was said to be in Winnipeg, which is a city in Manitoba. Tim at the time was working at a carnival when he would board the Greyhound bus, traveling back home to where his girlfriend, who was pregnant at the time, would be waiting to see him. Tim was said to have gotten on the bus, found a seat towards the back of the bus, and started listening to music to pass the time. As the bus made a stop in Erickson, Manitoba, another man named Vincent Wagwan Lee, I'm so sorry I butchered that, also known as Vince Lee, that's what he will be known as from here forward, that's what he was reported as, and honestly, that's the easiest to say, as Vince Lee boarded the bus around 6 p.m. Passengers of the bus remembered Vince acting irritated, confused, and a little agitated as he boarded the bus, but was said to have been able to settle in a seat towards the front of the bus. Vince Lee was a Chinese immigrant of Canada, said to be a former computer programmer who had known to have had mental health issues since the year of 2004, and friends of Vince said that they never knew him to be violent. As the bus made another stop, Vince would move seats, this time towards the back of the bus, and actually wound up right next to Tim. Now, no one knows why he switched seats. All we know is that he did, for some reason or another. At the time, Tim was said to have been asleep while his head was pressed against the window. A little before 8 p.m., a scene would erupt that no one could have predicted or seen coming that would have a lasting traumatic impression on everyone involved. For some unknown reason, Vince would pull out what was said to be a large knife and just started stabbing Tim in what was described as an absolute frenzy. 35 passengers on the bus with Vince and Tim bolted awake when they heard, quote, blood-curdling screams. This is when the bus driver was said to have pulled over and everyone who was on the bus fled. A passenger who was said to be a veteran had decided to try to help this poor man by stopping Vince somehow. During the attack, there had been a truck driver named Chris Alguier who had seen the bus, and he pulled off to the side of the road to see if he could help. The two men tried to see if they could help Tim and tried to take control of the situation. Chris had helped the passengers who were already upset towards his trailer, towards the back of the bus. He kind of directed them, here are my tools if anybody wanted to take one for protection, as nobody was really sure how this would turn out. Around 8:30 p.m., so not long after the attack started, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were called about the stabbing, and it didn't take them long to arrive at the gruesome scene that was unfolding. As the authorities arrived, they would find passengers on the side of the road crying, and at one point, people started vomiting at what came next. Unfortunately, while Vince still had the knife in his hand, he would slash the air pointed towards the men to try to keep them back. And these are for the men, the truck driver and the veteran who tried to go back onto the bus to help Tim. They were really not able to do anything to help him. The two men who tried to help were forced to flee the bus as well and join the rest of the passengers who were just standing in the road watching this horrific scene. At this point, the bus was locked and barricaded so that Vince would not be able to escape. This is when something absolutely horrific would take place, as Vince, with the large knife in his hand, was able to, trigger warning, decapitate Tim. Vince would proceed to lift the decapitated head of Tim to show the onlookers who were just standing there, forced to watch this traumatic and sickening event unfold. After this horrendous display for the passengers to see, Vince would continue his attack on poor Tim's remains. Vince was absolutely obliterating Tim's remains and removing internal organs. It was reported that Vince was seen smelling and then eating different parts of Tim's flesh. Vince was also seen licking blood off his hands. One witness stated that Vince wasn't showing any signs of rage or any strong feelings, but that he was scarily calm like a robot stabbing a man. Chris, the truck driver, said that he helped to barricade the door to keep Vince inside the bus and unable to escape. Many years later, the truck driver would state that even though it had been 10 years since the traumatic event, that he had never stopped mourning Tim's life. He also said that his own PTSD showed itself as alcoholism and rage, which is horrific. He stated he was very frustrated with the response of the RCMP and how long it took them to engage with Vince. He stated that he kept telling the police to shoot Vince. After what he had done, there wasn't any reason for this man to stay alive. The standoff between Vince and the authorities would take 5 hours before they were able to detain Vince. When Vince realized at some point that he was locked inside of the bus, he attempted to smash out windows in effort to escape. However, his attempt was quashed when he was shot twice with a taser and was able to be detained at that time by the authorities. When the authorities were finally able to gain access to the bus, it was said that they found, quote, body parts littered throughout the bus, some in white plastic bags, end quote. After Vince was detained, authorities did their best to recover the remains of Tim from the bus, but unfortunately Tim's heart and eyes were never recovered. Among the remains they would ultimately find Tim's nose, ear, and his tongue in Vince's pocket. It is believed that the parts that were missing of Tim's remains were eaten by Vince. After the tragic and brutal murder of Tim McLean, Canada demanded answers as to what in the fuck happened and why Vince would do this. In 2012, Vince would give an answer to the public when he would go on to tell BBC that he, quote, heard the voice of God speaking to him and that the voice sent him on a mission to protect people from an alien invasion, end quote. He would further state, quote, the voice told me that I was the third story of the Bible, that I was the second coming of Jesus. I was to save the people from the space alien attack, end quote. Then Vince added that he was indeed very sorry. So this is obviously some sort of mental illness, and we will cover what Vince is diagnosed with, which some of you can probably guess, and I will go into depth a little bit on what that illness is. But for now, I'm going to continue to talk about this quote-unquote mission that Vince thought that he was on. So it was said that Vince had started to prepare for this quote-unquote mission that he was told to complete. The voice told Vince some instructions that he was to travel the country either on a bus or on foot. Vince was married during this time, which surprised me. His wife would later go on to say that Vince would often disappear for days at a time for unexpected trips, and that he was known to ramble. I am 100% not blaming his wife by any means, but I feel like there was maybe a missed opportunity to get Vince some help during these ramblings and times of disappearing. I feel like if a loved one just takes off from time to time, especially your partner, and is known to ramble the way that he did, maybe it's time to have someone take a look at what's going on. I mean, obviously, I don't know all of the facts, but if the passengers were able to tell that Vince seemed agitated and confused a bit, then you would think that the people around Vince, especially his wife, would maybe be able to see that something was going on with Vince. And I wish that he was just able to get some sort of help before all of this happened. It was said that Vince had been convinced of the fact that his life was constantly in danger from what he thought were aliens who had infiltrated our world, and this is why Vince would start to carry a quote-unquote buck knife to protect himself. This, of course, would be the same knife that was used to kill Tim McLean. No matter what side of gun control laws or whatever you fall on, I think it's safe to say that all of us wish that there was some way to keep weapons from people who have severe mental health issues and that are a danger to the public. I understand saying this, that's nearly impossible to know, like who is or isn't having issues, especially when it comes to buying a knife, as I would guess there probably aren't laws on buying knives. So from what I could find after researching this a little bit was that in Canada there is no blade size restrictions on knives, but it did say that in order to carry one that it has to be visible and cannot be concealed. It also says that it's to be used as a tool, but obviously there is no way to know if someone is using it as a weapon. Also, just because it's the law to carry it in the open doesn't necessarily mean that people follow that law, and I'm sure they conceal them all the time. Plus, if Vince had some mental health issues, he may not have necessarily been up to date nor care about the law if he believed that he was under attack at all times. It was said that while Vince was on the bus, a voice told him, quote, murder the man sitting beside him, or else he would be killed himself, end quote. It was further said that Vince actually believed that Tim was an alien and a demon that was in need of being destroyed. Vince further stated that he had mutilated Tim's body, believing that he was preventing Tim from coming back to life, which is both disturbing and sad. Vince would eventually be charged with second-degree murder, to which he would plead NCR, meaning not criminally responsible because of mental illness. When Vince entered the plea of NCR, it is reported that Vince said only 3 words to the court during his plea, quote, please kill me. In March of 2009, Vince would be found not criminally responsible for his murderous actions because of his mental illness. He would then be committed to the Selkirk Mental Health Center. Not criminally responsible from the Canadian government page states, quote, people who commit criminal acts under the influence of mental illness should not be held criminally responsible for their actions or omissions in the same way that sane, responsible people are, end quote. It goes on to say that people who are legally insane shouldn't be convicted of a crime if they are unable to grasp the seriousness or moral agent of their actions. Also, if they are unable to discern between right and wrong. Tim McLean's family feels that justice has not been served. Tim's mother, Carol Day DeLay, says, quote, whether he was in the right frame of mind or not, he still did the act. There was nobody else on that bus holding a knife, slicing up my child, end quote. Oh my God, that is absolutely gut-wrenching. Tim's father, Tim McLean Sr., was said to have gotten a tattoo of his face over where his heart is, but then he told BBC that he still struggled some days. How could he not, really? He would further say, quote, although we're trying to move forward, it's still an ongoing challenge. I don't believe we will ever fully recover, end quote. To honor their son's memory, there has been placed a white cross along the road where Tim was killed in Portage-la Prairie. On it, just below Tim's name, says, quote, I think of you always, son. Love, Dad. Oh my God, I can absolutely not imagine what they continue to go through on a daily basis. Apparently next to the cross that was erected for Tim is another cross, and on the cross has Tim's blue work shirt and some sporty sunglasses that are attached at the collar. Sometimes during true crime, I hear of these parents who have learned or have to listen to just the brutal, horrific crimes that happen to their children. And although I don't allow my brain to even go there with my own children, because if I do, it will put me in a very dark place. But every so often, your brain slips from protecting you, and you're just like, can you imagine having to hear and having to imagine the image of the brutality of what your own kid went through when this happens? I can't even. How do you move on from that? You don't, I'm sure. Carol, Tim's mother, was quoted saying about her son's murder, quote, When this very first happened, for weeks and weeks, I was just mad. Nothing changed for everybody else. The traffic still went, the sun still shone, and it was so maddening to me that the whole world didn't just stop. Mine did. It stopped, and it took a long time to really want to get up every day. End quote. Okay, so let's talk about Vince's unchecked mental health diagnosis. We can probably all guess, but it is reported that Vince was suffering and probably still is from obviously, at this time, untreated schizophrenia. One source said that it was actually paranoid schizophrenia during this murder, which makes sense if he thought he was under attack. Following this diagnosis, Vince was placed in a mental health facility for treatment. So, what is schizophrenia? According to psychiatry.org, schizophrenia is a chronic disorder that affects the brain. When this disorder is active, people suffering from schizophrenia can experience symptoms such as hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, trouble thinking, and a lack of motivation. The website further explains some definitions of the symptoms or problems associated with schizophrenia. I'm going to summarize these definitions just so we can get a feel for things that someone who is not being treated may go through. So, first is psychosis. Symptoms of this include a disruption in the way that our brains process information and a loss of touch with reality due to this. Delusions are considered, quote, fixed, false beliefs held despite clear or reasonable evidence that they are not true, end quote. Another point on delusions are that they can be persecutory or paranoid, which means the person believes that they are being harassed or harmed by a group of people or another person. These are usually the most common types of paranoid delusions. Next, we have hallucinations, which are experiences of things that are not there, and these can include feeling, smelling, tasting, seeing, or hearing. These are so vivid to this person that it is extremely similar to normal perceptions. The auditory hallucinations are when the person hears voices, and these are most common in schizophrenia and other related psychotic disorders. So we hear people with schizophrenia hear voices, like I'm sure we hear this all the time, and I have always wondered what that meant exactly. Like they quote unquote hear voices, but this is in their heads, right? So do they know that the voice is in their head, or are they audibly hearing things? Well, let me share my experience with you that can help you to understand the answer to this question. So in my own life, I have only known one or two people that have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, but there was a time not long ago where I got the opportunity to talk to somebody who suffers from this and what their experience was like. I ended up working in a salon with a girl from another location who filled in for someone in our shop who had called in, and halfway through the day, we started talking about her life and stuff that she had gone through when she shared with me that she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I was surprised, as she did seem a little odd, but nothing more than that to me, which whatever, I'm not judging. We're all a little weird and odd in our own ways. So she was cool about sharing her experiences with me about how she got diagnosed and what it was like for her, which, being fascinated by psychology and medical stuff, I was so excited to hear her stuff. She explained that before she was diagnosed, that she had been struggling with some different stuff. If I remember correctly, maybe some depression and just feeling off. She said that her family had come to her worried about her behavior, but at that time she didn't realize how bad it was. And in her eyes, it was just life, and maybe things were a little harder, but that's it. Then she explained to me that she started hearing voices, which fascinated the shit out of me. I asked what it was like for her, and she said that for her, when she started hearing voices, she legitimately thought that her mom was playing a prank on her and had a speaker up high in her room and was talking to her through it just to mess with her. This is what she actually thought was happening for a while. She said it was an actual voice that she could hear around her as if someone was talking to her, but she couldn't see them, which is just wild. And I can imagine would be so scary and confusing for someone experiencing this. She said that after she told her family what was going on with the voices, they were able to get her some help, and that's when she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And once she started the medication, the voices subsided, and now she doesn't hear anything. If I'm not mistaken, I believe she also said that she ended up robbing the place before she was medicated, that she had worked at the time, and she wasn't exactly sure why she did it, except I think she said that the voices had told her to do so, and she said it was confusing for her because she liked the lady she worked for and actually had no problems with her. But for some reason, she felt compelled to take the money when she left. which is terrifying to imagine that there is no reason for her to have wanted to steal because she liked her job and the lady, but these quote-unquote forces or voices must be rather strong to make people do the things that they do, which is scary for them and for us. Wild. So the next definition is for disorganized thinking and speech, and this refers to speech or thoughts that become jumbled or don't make any sense. The example that is used is the person suffering from schizophrenia may switch topics quickly or respond with a topic that is unrelated in that conversation. The website states that this can be so severe that people will struggle with just normal communication. The last definition is about disorganized or abnormal motor behavior, which can be movements that can manifest in different ways. This can be unpredictable agitation, repeated movements with no purpose, or even childlike silliness. The website continues by saying that when behavioral issues are severe enough that it can interfere with daily activities of life and poor performances. This can also include catatonia, which we probably all know means like when a person is dazed and not with it, without hardly any movement or responses to their environment, like a catatonic state. So to top off this little segment learning about schizophrenia, the website talks about treatment for people, which obviously there is no cure, but a lot of people with treatment can do very well and have just minimal symptoms. There are many different antipsychotic medications that reduce the symptoms as well as reducing potential for future episodes and may reduce their severity. The thing that I found interesting is with some people who suffer schizophrenia, there is something called anosognosia, which is basically a lack of awareness of their disorder. It states that some people with psychosis may have anosognosia throughout their entire illness, and these are sufferers who are less likely to stay in treatment and are people who are more likely to relapse while experiencing involuntary treatments, as well as having poor psychosocial functioning. I found it interesting that schizophrenia seems to be like an illness where people suffer from episodes of psychosis, but they don't necessarily stay in that state all the time. When it spoke to the medications being able to reduce future episodes, to me that means that sometimes even when untreated, the person suffering isn't always suffering to the full extent of the illness. Like maybe they ramble or think things that are untrue, etc., but it doesn't seem like they will constantly be suffering from the worst parts of the illness all the time. Maybe that's why it goes undiagnosed in some people for so long, because it isn't always a full-blown episode all the time. But that's also terrifying because of things like what Vince Lee did. So this next part is probably very controversial, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. In February of 2017, Vince Lee was actually granted absolute discharge, and since this, it's reported that he is living alone in a community inside of Manitoba. Furthermore, the Criminal Code Review Board for this province has said that he is no longer required to attend yearly reviews, and he doesn't need to be closely monitored. I'm sorry, what? Like, regardless of where you fall on mental health versus punishment, is it not scary as fuck to think that someone who has actually killed someone else because of their mental health issues is now just living free somewhere? And without being monitored, they could just decide that one day they no longer need their medications or whatever to keep them in check and could go back to being paranoid and hurt someone else. I don't like that at all. I understand the mental health part, absolutely. But for some reason in my head, like I thought he was just going to spend his life in the hospital instead of jail, which I can understand. But what the fuck? He's free? I just don't understand that. Tim's mother was quoted saying, quote, "I do not believe public safety is a paramount concern when mass murderers and serial killers can plead NCR," end quote. So something that I found interesting while searching Canadian laws when it comes to the not criminally responsible is that just because someone is found to not be criminally responsible, it doesn't mean that there is an automatic acquittal. There is a third option. It's what was used here for the review board, which is constituted of a person who is either a judge or someone qualified for judicial appointment. And there are 4 other members, and one of them has to be able to practice psychiatry. And they conduct the individual assessment as to whether the accused is treating their mental disorder and if the public will need protection from future dangerous behavior. So the review board has 3 options when it comes to either the court or the review board to make a final decision for the accused. The 3 choices are absolute discharge, conditional discharge, and detention in custody in a hospital. Under a section numbered 672.54, the review board, quote, must order the disposition that is the least onerous and least restrictive to the accused, end quote. Onerous, in case anyone doesn't know, because I didn't, means involving heavy obligations or involving an amount of effort that is difficult and oppressively burdensome. It further goes on to say that the board or court should only impose restraints if there is need to secure the safety of the public. So basically, under this section of law, the review board has to make the decision that is the least burdensome for the accused and the least restrictive, and then says they should only impose any kind of restraint to the accused, aka the person who murdered someone brutally in this case, if there is concern for public safety. I think there's concern for public safety here, no? Like, what the fuck? What further interested me is that under the conditional discharge, they can impose things for the accused, which they may need, to reside in a group home. They can abstain from alcohol or illegal drugs. They can submit a UA, which is a urine analysis for prohibited substances, abide by a special treatment plan, report to a designated person like a psychiatrist on a scheduled basis, and to refrain from possessing weapons. So any of those could be used under the conditional discharge that, in my own opinion, should have absolutely happened in this case. He was absolutely discharged, meaning no restrictions, which is absolutely nuts to me. In my own opinion, at the very least, this man should need to report to a psychiatrist who can continue to make sure that this man is on his much-needed medications, and he would absolutely need to abide by a treatment plan of, taking his medications, maybe never ride a fucking bus again, not own a weapon. Like, what the fuck is happening here? This man brutally murdered a man, decapitated, showed off the body parts to the other people, and cannibalized him. But now that he's medicated, they're like, oh, he's not a danger anymore, and they send him back out. Like, what a slap in the face to Tim's family, and how scary for the public out there. What if he comes off his medication? Vince would go on to change his name to Will Lee Baker while living with his freedom. I wonder if he, received death threats or something. And also, do you think that he should be allowed to change his name? I disagree with this so much. He did the crime, and at very least, people should know who they live by or are dealing with at work, etc., when he is capable of such brutality. It is said that there was an outrage and controversy, of course, when the news of his release came out, especially by Tim's mother, which in my own opinion is absolutely warranted. It was said from the chief executive of the Schizophrenia Society of Canada, who is a man named Chris Somerville, about Vince Lee, quote, he has been a model citizen. He lives every day with remorse about what he did, and he knows it was atrocious and he will never forgive himself, end quote. Somerville would go on to say that Vince understands now that schizophrenia plays tricks on his brain and it's a mental illness. He further explained that Vince now knows that his medication will keep those voices away. It's reported that there is a low risk of recidivism for people in Vince's situation. It's actually only 7% compared to the federal prison north of Winnipeg, where the recidivism rate is approximately 47%. Vince, while speaking to Somerville, said he understands that people are afraid of him. In a transcript that Somerville read of his interaction with Vince, he quoted Vince as saying, quote, I understand people are scared because of my behavior on the Greyhound bus. I am not at risk for anybody. I don't believe in aliens. I don't hear voices. I take my medication every day. I'm glad to take it. I don't have any weird voices anymore. End quote. Vince further told Somerville that he would like to be forgiven. He said he would do anything for Tim McLean's family. He said he wants them to forgive him, but he knows that that would be hard to accept. The chief executive states that society has nothing to worry about, but not all are convinced. Especially Tim's mother, who made a statement that were close to my questions about his discharge. She said, quote, Vince Lee got help. Good for him. Maybe he's feeling better today. My son is still dead. What if he chooses not to take his medication? We know what he's capable of. End quote. Which is what I wanted to know. Shouldn't someone be holding him responsible for the very least to ensure that he's medicated? I think that's scary. The truck driver who helped to trap Vince inside the bus says he just doesn't understand why Vince Lee was given the discharge as well, and the, quote, freedom to repeat his actions. During the court testimony, it was found that Vince had been admitted to a mental hospital back in 2005, and this would be where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. The judge in the trial went on to say, quote, "Unfortunately, he appears to have left the treatment facility without permission," end quote. So, did anyone look for him? Did anyone report him as leaving? Was he prescribed medication that he was supposed to be taking, but then he stopped? Did he ever get on a medication? I have so many questions about why this was just dropped back in 2005. Carol speaks to the fact that she feels like for her own soul and self-being, she needs to be able to accept what has happened, but says, quote, "But what would be unforgivable for me would be to not do anything to try to prevent this from happening again by the same perpetrator. I don't think Vince Lee can be trusted to take his medication," end quote. Carol said that she feels that Vince should be kept in a mental hospital permanently. However, she seemed to understand that he would probably gain more and more freedom and eventually be released. She would go on to say that if Vince isn't responsible for his own actions and behavior, then she felt the government should be stepping up and taking responsibility for Vince for the rest of his life then. In my own opinion, I actually agree with this. So, in the aftermath of the tragic events, many people who witnessed this horrific scene are still struggling themselves. In 2001, it was said that 2 of the passengers filed lawsuits against the Greyhound Bus Service, Vince Lee, the RCMP, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Canadian government, to which they are asking for $3 million in compensation for them having to witness the murder and cannibalism. Apparently, this suit was dropped in 2015 because the bus line stated that they could not be sued due to Manitoba's system of quote-unquote no-fault vehicle insurance. Tim McLean Sr. and his family also launched a lawsuit against Vince Lee, Greyhound, and the Attorney General of Canada. He stated that from the very first day, they had received condolences from everybody surrounding this tragedy, including the RCMP, the media, Transport Canada, but apparently Greyhound never said anything to the family, which they felt was unacceptable. So, in one source, it said that one of the passengers from the day of the attack is struggling with such bad PTSD from the attack that when she later gave birth to a baby girl years later, social workers had to take the newborn away from her mother for the first 18 months of her life. After those 18 months, the baby was returned to her mother and apparently her grandmother as well. Also, the court gave the grandmother responsible and generous access to help with decision-making and care of her granddaughter. The mother of the baby girl says that she is still struggling with trusting people and using any public transportation. She also says that she's struggling with nightmares. The grandmother at the time had hoped that her daughter would be able to get the medical and counseling help that she needed. I can't find if she was able to get help or not, but I hope that she's doing better, as they didn't release her name, which is completely understandable. But I just hope that she was able to get the help that she deserves. I feel like the people who went through this, like having to watch, should be offered counseling and help for free. Or Vince Lee should have to pay like restitution for those medical bills or something, because this is one of those extenuating circumstances where this would absolutely affect the rest of your life in various ways. And it's so sad because they didn't ask for this, and yet they too are suffering. I guess Tim's mother finds a little comfort in Tim's son, who he never got to meet. Ugh, this hurts my heart so much. Tim's mother has gone on to report that her grandson was born just 5 months after Tim was murdered. She is said to have called her grandson a blessing from Tim, and that he motivates her to keep going in her life and wakes up every day as well, taking care of him. She says, quote, "He's a gift from God, and I believe Tim sent him to me," end quote. Unfortunately, there does seem to be a custody battle over this poor boy when it comes to Tim's parents and the mother of the child, who reportedly hasn't seen her son in quite some time. Again, these are the articles from 2018, so I'm not sure where they're at right now with it, but Carol, who at the time of this stated that the son knew a little of the story of what happened to his father and that he was receiving therapy for it, and unfortunately, she knew at some point that she would need to just tell the whole story and work through it with him before he found out from anyone else, which is just heart-wrenching. I hope that Tim's son, and of course his mother, have found peace and happiness because they deserve that. And that, my friends, is the horrific story of the Greyhound Bus Murder, Tim McLean's awful end, and Vince Lee's absolutely gruesome attack on a stranger. This story was so fascinating to me because of the psychology behind it and the absolute horror of thinking that this could happen to anyone at any time. Like, this poor man was just sleeping on a bus headed home and was attacked out of nowhere in the most grisly, atrocious, appalling way for absolutely no reason. So I'm very curious to hear what your guys' thoughts are on the way things were handled for Vince Lee. Do you think justice was served for Tim? Do you agree with Vince being treated in a mental hospital and eventually let go? I'm torn because while I sympathize with Vince for having this mental disorder that caused him to act in a way that he normally would not have, I can't help but put myself in Tim's mother's place. Like, I'm glad that Vince got treatment, but her son is still dead. And I personally feel that Vince should still have repercussions for that. In the very least, I think that Vince should have to spend a life sentence, which I believe here in the US is like no less than 25 years, in a mental hospital. Because he murdered someone in cold blood and in a brutal way, sick or not. I don't think it's very fair to just let him off the hook after he's medicated and then released back into society like, well, I hope he keeps taking his meds, because if not, this could happen again. It's just wild to me. It makes me wonder what would have happened if this happened here in the US. We don't seem to focus on the mental health part as much as sending people away, which I think people should absolutely get help with their mental health. That's so fucking important. But he still killed someone. In this case, to me, it makes it worse that he had been hospitalized before and diagnosed with schizophrenia, but then just escaped, and that was it. Like, at that point, he should be held accountable in some way, that he didn't take responsibility for his own mental health. I mean, it did say that he was married, right? So he had to have had some periods of more stable times in his life, and I think it's unfair that he didn't seek out treatment. So when he went through an episode of delusions and hallucinations, someone had to give their life because he didn't get help. I don't know, this whole story is just so sad, and my heart goes out to Tim's son, who is much older now, Tim's mother and father, and anyone else who was affected by this loss. Oh, and the people from the bus who had to witness this, it makes me so sad that many are suffering from PTSD or issues and aren't being offered help and just left to deal. I think that's crap. Why was Vince's mental health so important, but these poor bystanders' mental health isn't? Let me know your thoughts down below if you are a YouTube listener, and let me know your thoughts on any social media platform if you follow us about this case. Controversial to say the least. I hope to see you guys next Monday as we will dive into another case here on The Kill File. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today, you guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to another episode of The Kill File. Don't forget to check out the merch shop, either at thekillfile.com and click Shop Merch, or you can visit thekillfile.printify.me/products for some awesome true crime merch. Also, follow along on The Kill File socials for posts about episodes, pictures about the cases, for updates, and more. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X as The Kill File, and we are on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out the website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host. You can learn a little bit more about how The Kill File got started, and you can suggest a case right there on the website. Let me know in your case suggestion if you want me to shout out your name if I cover your case. There is contact info on the site as well. You guys have no idea how much I love to hear from you. It makes my whole day. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.